the University of California, Riverside presents Blue, Gold, and Black, the podcast that's dedicated to amplifying Black voices at UCR. I'm Dominique Beale from UCR's Community Engagement and Outreach Unit. In each episode, we'll be talking to UCR students, campus leaders, and community partners to explore the intersection of being Black and being a Highlander at UCR. And I can't wait for you to meet today's guest. Let's get started. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Blue, Gold, and Black podcast. My name is Dominique Beale. I am your host. Super happy to amplify another Black voice on campus today. We have someone joining us from the history department, Professor Adelusi-Adeluyis. I know I murdered it. I've been practicing, I promise. Professor, could you please properly tell us how to pronounce your name?
Sure. Hi, Dominic. Thank you for having me. This is so exciting. So I'm Yoruba, and my full name, so I guess I'm Dr. Ademide Adelusi-Adeluyi. In America, people call me Ademide. So I guess you could call me, Professor Ademide or Professor or Dr. Ademide, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. Or just Ademide. That's good too.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. But nobody
hardly anyone can say my name, so this is totally normal.
That makes me feel a little bit better, but it's funny, I used to work in a school that was really predominantly like Latino, and so there's a lot of unique names in that culture, and I always knew I struggled with it, but you just have to fight through the embarrassment and actually try. I think that goes a long way. So I appreciate you for, making that a lot easier to deal with.
Of course.
But super happy to have you here. So let's just dive in. Obviously, you are a professor of history, of African history. Can you please kind of just tell us, though, more in depth about what that means? Where is your area of study in particular? And let's just expand from there.
Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you, Dominique. Mm-hmm. So like you said, I'm a historian. My research is mostly on cities, especially 19th century cities in West Africa. So I'm really interested right now in the book. I'm finishing a book right now called Imagine Lagos. And part of this is a study of mid-19th century Lagos. So I study the city of Lagos from the 1840s to about the 1860s. And I also study the lagoon community that Lagos is part of. Most people think of Lagos as an Atlantic city, but actually it's at the center of a lagoon community that includes cities like Badagry, Ouidah, other ones. So I'm really interested in the way that they're connected, how men and women lived in these cities, how they built them, how they changed them, even how they destroyed them over political conquest and other things. I'm also interested in how the things that we do leave a mark on the city. What kind of mark did freedom, slavery, issues of gender, and other things leave traces in the places that we live. So I'm really interested in digital mapping, and I do a lot of map making as a way of reinventing and sort of narrating the past of the city, especially of places like Lagos. And you can see some of my maps online. I'll plug my website.
Yes.
It's called New Maps. It's called newmapsoldlagos.com.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's super interesting. Now, I find African history very interesting just because it can be very hard to conceptualize it, right? It's not readily available in most educational systems. And you actually grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, right?
Yes.
Yeah, go. No, please tell us. I want you to tell us kind of about that experience because I think it's going to help provide context into the work that you're doing.
Okay, excellent. So I'm from Lagos, Nigeria, like you said. Let me see. What is Lagos like? Lagos is kind of a mixed bag, right? If you ask me, it's the most exciting city in the world. And I've been to Tokyo. I lived in New York, so I still maintain that. LA is okay. Whatever. Don't hate me.
Okay. No, you have credit. You have credit.
But to be honest, Lagos is a very difficult place to live. It's very, very dense. There's a lot of income inequality. There's a lot of issues with our infrastructure. There's a lot of issues with security, with in Nigeria, we've struggled between the military regimes and democracy, how to distribute wealth and resources equally. So if I tell you Lagos is amazing, you go there and you see all this poverty, all this pain, but then you're having this really great time also, depending on who you're with. So Lagos is a very dynamic place. The energy is palpable. People are wonderful. They're warm. They're happy. It's a mixed ethnic bag. Some, I guess, a little bit mixed. There's a lot of people from different parts of Nigeria and West Africa and Africa who live there. But at the same time, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of people sometimes do things because of their situation or their circumstances. So it's a difficult place to be, to live in and to leave. Lagos, I've had some of the best years of my life, even as an undergrad in Lagos. So I miss it a lot, but there's a lot of benefits also to being in America. So that's my description.
Wow. No, and I love that you kind of gave the honesty in both sides of it, right? And I think, while what happens in Lagos might be unique because it's in Lagos, like the overarching principle can be applied to a lot of different places around the world. And being able to kind of go through those experiences and maybe look back at them from a different vantage point, you can appreciate them and also be able to objectively, call them for what they were. So just kind of expanding on that, like, can you talk to us about, I want to say, like, your educational experience growing up in Lagos, Nigeria, and especially around history, because I want to know, were you always interested in this passion for history, particularly in Lagos, or was that something that came to you later in life?
Oh, that's definitely something that came later. I mean, growing up in Nigeria, there's really a sense that your education is a tool, right? Education is really important, and this is how you're going to make a living, take care of yourself, take care of your family. So history was not, even an option, I don't think, that I considered. I guess when I was younger, I liked a lot of things. I wanted to be a lot of different things. I'll be a poet, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But then as a teenager, I was good at math. So I was immediately, and I'm a girl, so I was immediately sort of put in the science track. So since I was about 13 or 14, I'd been in science and math classes. And that meant that I didn't really do a lot of the humanities courses in secondary school. That's what we call high school in Nigeria. So I did a lot of technical work. I did a lot of mathematics, further math, things like that. And I think I took a social studies course in high school, which is not really history, but you learned a little bit. And so I would say that actually I never took a history class till I got to the U.S.
Wow.
And history in general. So forget about African history. So this is not something, I knew of like famous people, and the high school I went to, we had like famous, like a dorm would be named like Moremi Hall, like Queen Moremi, Queen Amina, like those names, but it wasn't really something that I thought about a lot. So I would say I got far more interested in history as an adult.
I think that's interesting because I feel like when I think of, my perception of the Black African American experience or the Black African American relationship to history, I think there's a lot of similarities in that sense, right? Like history is kind of fed to us here in a way, especially throughout high school, where it's just very snapshotty, and we get a few like trademark moments or a few big names. But anything revolving around Black or African history was just not there, except during certain parts of the year. So it's very interesting that you had that same experience growing up in Lagos, Nigeria. So when you got ready to pursue college and you're getting ready to finish secondary school or high school, did you know you wanted to come to America to pursue college, or what was it that inspired you to make such a huge transition for your education?
It's such an interesting question. So, it's very complex. In Nigeria, our educational system has suffered also from some of the problems I mentioned earlier. Some people know about the brain drain that happened in the 80s. Why do you have so many Nigerian professors in the United States? There was a time that people had to flee the country and come here. So in a way, in Nigeria, the options that are pushed is that to get a better education. So the schools used to be really, really great. Like my father went to college in Nigeria. But by the time I came around to college age, there was a sense that going abroad was better. But But it was interesting. I thought I would go to England because it's closer. It's a lot more people I know. Actually, a lot more people I know went to England.
Wow.
But that didn't quite work out. And so, but that definitely my generation, let me say, like finishing high school in the 90s, there was definitely a sense that, a better education could be had outside Nigeria. So I actually never thought about coming to America. I just wanted to come to Disneyland,
okay,
which I still haven't made it to. But my parents had an African American friend who worked for USAID, and she encouraged my parents after my school closed again because of a crisis and a strike and blah blah blah. And she encouraged us to do the SATs, and she was able to help us with different resources and things, which is how I ended up. So my first time in America was to come for school.
Wow.
So it's not really something I had. So it was a very big turn for me, someone who had spent more time in Europe, to come to America. It was really incredible.
Yeah. Can you talk about, like, just from a social standpoint, like, what did coming to America, growing up in Lagos, Nigeria, like, what was that for you, especially like in the midst of like the 90s, the early 2000s, like, what was that experience for you?
Well, it was very fortunate, first of all. I was very fortunate to be able to come here, to be able to come to undergraduate here. It was such an incredible blessing. I mean, I had a lot of friends who were here. A lot of my friends were at Howard or at, different schools around the country. I ended up in Boston, whatever. It was
interesting.
There were some issues. But I knew a little bit about America from television, right? So
okay.
I think one of the first things, so American TV is everywhere. I remember getting CNN when I was a child. We watched a lot of American television. In fact, I remember growing up, there was a time that the government said we had to decrease the amount of foreign television that we watched because, all the same shows some of the same shows were popular in Nigeria. I can't remember all of them, like X-Files. Like, I don't want to get the dates mixed up. Like, this was the 90s. But they're all, imagine a lot of 90s shows like 90210, I guess maybe A Different World. I'm mixing up dates. So, I mean, I consumed a lot of American media, definitely music, as you know. American music is very popular around the world. Definitely hip-hop, R&B. My sister loved Anita Baker. I loved Tracy Chapman.
Wow.
Like, we all loved American music. So in a way, I feel like I knew a lot about America. I mean, people love Marvin Gaye, Michael Jackson. It's funny. I remember growing up thinking that this music was for me. So, it's so global that you think people are singing for you. So it's kind of been a shock to come to California and be like, these are real places with real people, and the West Coast is a real scene. So it's been. So I knew a little bit about America. Also, my mother went to college here in California, actually in the 60s. So imagine a young Muslim woman here in California and also Arizona. So I knew a little bit about America, but I'd never been. So there's a lot of media consumption. And, there were positive things and there were negative things, that I'd heard about America. But I'd met so few, I think, Americans and probably I met more white Americans than African Americans, I would say, growing up. Definitely.
Interesting. And so now that you're here, you're in college, please tell us really quickly, what college you went to and what was your major. And let's start, I guess, unpacking how you started falling into this love for history.
So it's funny. I did some years in Nigeria, and for complicated reasons, I came, to the U.S., but I wasn't able to continue my architecture degree here. So I ended up doing computer engineering with a kind of side of architecture, and I went to Northeastern University in Boston. It's funny. My brother and I came at the same time, so he picked the South and I picked the North. So that's kind of how I ended up in Boston. And so I don't know if you know this, but in engineering, when you're in engineering school, you don't get a lot of electives, right? It's, Calc 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, all these very technical classes. And so I know you told me, I was thinking about this, what inspired me to start thinking about African history? And it's funny, I had a few professors who were really amazing in undergrad. So even though I was a computer engineering major, I had this incredible professor who did math And I feel like he cracked open my head and poured like knowledge in. So then for a while I wanted to be a math major. Then I took this elective, and I remember this professor, it was an elective on African music. And I remember I told my mother, I'm taking this class on African music. And she was like, I can't believe you're in America spending our dollars on, pop music. And I was like, no, it's incredible. Not only am I learning more about, and I remember feeling so proud in that class. I heard about music from Mali, music from Guinea, from South Africa, from Kenya. I was like, I remember the real sense of pride, even just in the music. And I learned more about Nigerian music. Someone like Fela Kuti. I didn't know so much about his politics, his political awakening, all the activist work that he did with his music and his own transformation from being an elite figure to somebody who became a populist fighting for people. So in a way, it was really transformative. And I should say also in Nigeria, I did have one professor in my architecture school who taught about indigenous African architecture and how we could build for our environments with our local materials. And so while a lot of people would teach about, let's build the Western way, he was very invested in thinking about Africa and taking Africa seriously. So that was David Aradian, and he's a really incredible person. So I would say I had a glimmer of awakening in Nigeria there, but definitely it's the two electives I took in undergrad. So one with music, and then I took another class with a professor, Robin Kilson, in African American studies. And I'd always liked literature, but I took this class and it was incredible. It was me and all these students, and we were debating culture and history, and I didn't know anything about history. And I didn't know any African American history. I didn't know any African history. And she's like, but you're so invested in being Yoruba, your language, your culture, your people. I was like, yes. And she's like, how do you not know? How are you Yoruba and you don't know about Shango? How are you Yoruba and you're not interested in Oshun? How are you Catholic? And I was like, well, it's colonialism, right? Why am I speaking with this accent? It's colonialism. So I really started, and she was so brilliant. Unfortunately, she died quite young, but there were just so many exciting conversations we had, and I wanted to know more. So that was really my undergraduate experience. Even though I graduated with an engineering degree, it was really formative for opening up that idea that this could be. I saw people who were doing this as part of their work and part of their living.
And I love the way that you kind of broke that down and you explained it, because I think that tends to happen to a lot of Black people within the diaspora in general. Like, there's always, whether you grow up in the circumstances that you grow up in and you develop a worldview based on that, right? And then, usually around the age that you're either going to college or you're maybe just venturing out on a different avenue as a young adult, like, you're exposed to different things that make you realize, like, there's a lot more to what I thought I knew. And it goes a lot deeper. And there's an explanation for the things that I'm seeing within my community or adjacent communities. And so can we just, I just identify a lot in terms of kind of just coming into the history in a different way, that it just finally makes sense to you. And you're like, oh, colonialism, like, that was a very real thing. And how could I not know about traditions or my past or my history? So talk to us just a little bit more about, like, how having a solid concept of your history just does something for your self-image as a African person.
Oh, I mean, it's incredible. It's such a privilege to be able to be a history professor. It's such a privilege to be able to do research about things you're interested in. And if that thing you're interested in is actually connected to yourself in a way, it's so fascinating, but at the same time quite painful, right? Yes. Because, I mean, I grew up, in a world where all my friends are trying to be lawyers, doctors, engineers. Like, that's what, and I was on that path too for a while. But the thing is, what do we know about ourselves? We grew up, some of the people I knew grew up with this idea that, the West is better. We should try to be like the West, but while at the same time holding on to our cultures, right? We're Igbo, we're Yoruba, we're Ishakiri, whatever we are. But that sense of what is our historical past is kind of something, and I wonder if my parents knew how little I knew, because they grew up with a different understanding of their history. Sure. But my generation tended, so if people who finished high school in let's say the 90s, for me, I remember being a little bit disconnected and being very sort of outward looking. There's a sense that everything foreign is better. But I think that history is so important. For me, it's just been incredible to learn more, not just about Nigeria or Lagos, but more about other places. I'm so interested in, thinking about Ghana, about, the Gold Coast, Kenya, all over the West African coast. I'm very lucky. I'm also married to a historian. So when we travel to do our research, I'm in Senegal, he's in Mali, we've been to all kinds of cities and places together. Wow. And there's something about getting to know, like, if all you study is other people's cultures and all you do is validate other people's cultures, that does some damage to you. Yeah. It's one thing to know your own past and other people's past and be able to compare and evaluate. But if everything you know is alien to you, it's that double consciousness. Like, what do you know about? Like, who are you exactly? And are you just sort of a negation or an inversion of someone else? This is something I think I struggle with here. There's not a lot of content, right, as you say. So learning more about Africa and just not just where I'm from, but other places has been so enriching and so enlightening, but also quite painful, because I think that sometimes we want to learn about the past. We might not always be happy with what we find, right? So one of the things I found out in learning about history is my mother is from a slave port. Lagos is a slave port. But I did not know, I think when I was in high school, I didn't really think about how African Americans got to America, right? Slavery is not something I grew up learning about. This is something I learned about. The history of slavery I learned in America. And I don't think I'm so strange. So I remember when I turned to thinking, I after undergrad, I got involved in the research project, and we're doing all this work on 1980s Lagos, oil boom Lagos. And I kept doing this research. You know how you're in between like undergrad and what you want to do with your life, right? So I got this summer job and I was helping someone. I was a research assistant. And then I was doing all this work and I kept finding all this historical material. And I was like, did you know? This is incredible. I'd go to this library, that library. I was living in Europe then. And they were like, no, Ademide, we're not interested in the 1950s. I was like, well, I found something on the 1920s. They're like, we're definitely not interested. And I was like, well, okay, now I've crossed the lines of the 19th century. And I was like, this is so fascinating. Like, Lagos is not just a city from the 20th century. Lagos is it's centuries old. And I was like, I'm so interested in this. And they're like, no. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to grad school. I don't want to do architecture. I don't want to do engineering anymore. I think I want to do... I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I was like, I want to really study cities and maybe history. And then I met another professor. Interestingly enough, I was doing a master's degree in Africana studies. It's kind of an interdisciplinary thing where you can kind of figure out, do you want to be literature? I actually wanted to study science fiction. And I remember I wanted to study science fiction and race. Yeah, that was my thing. But I didn't know that could be a thing. Jennings. I know, a little bit, but I didn't know. I was so young. I didn't know that this was a thing. And I met this professor, and he's like, have you considered doing a PhD in history? And I was like, no, but this is a thing. I could be a historian. He's like, yes, if you work hard enough, you maybe.
Okay. So you had to put the challenge in there.
Yes. So that's basically, I was super interested, but it wasn't clear how I would make a living. Because I didn't really, and ironically, where my father is from, we have the highest number of PhDs per capita. Well, that's the rumor anyway. Okay. So if I hadn't been so disconnected from those people, I would have known that history was totally viable, it's totally a normal option, and this is something I could do, and I could make a living. So I would say that professors actually thinking about it have been really instrumental in guiding me, showing what's possible, and also supporting me, and also challenging me, right?
Okay, nice. So, I studied psychology in undergrad, but I discovered towards the end of my undergrad that at least how I identify as a Black African American, you can't understand the psychology of anything without knowing the history. Like they're very intimately interlinked, I feel like. And so when I started just grabbing little tidbits about, Black psychology and African American history and different aspects of African history, outside of Egypt, it was very comforting, and it kind of, and like you said, it is a very sad thing, but in a way it grounds you. But I think it can be very hard to especially as a young student, like it can be very just hard to conceptualize African history. Like African history, it's thousands and thousands of ethnic groups. It's hundreds and hundreds of empires. It's the biggest continent. It's so many different types of people, so many different types of politics. What is one thing that you could say to young Black students that are interested in African or African American history? How can they like begin to approach it so it's not so daunting?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think even things like you said, like geography, like who knows, I mean, what is it? We hear there's like 1 billion Africans now living on the continent. And, we have to, I mean, Africa is very large. You're right. It's very complex. Nigeria alone, we have like hundreds of ethnic groups and languages. I only speak one Nigerian language, right? Well, okay, English. If you count English, that's okay. I won't put a number on it.
Sure.
Where would you start? Wow, I think that there are so many ways and so many avenues. I would say that my experience with students has always been, let your interests guide you, right? Are you interested in art? Are you interested in culture? Are you interested in literature? I mean, African literature is just so wonderful. I should say this is the one thing that I had growing up. We read a lot of West African and African writers in general. So there's so many gateways to learning about the past. There's so many wonderful writers. I mean, everywhere you go now, there's so many writers. I mean, even music, right? If it's Burna Boy, Burna Boy will connect you to Fela, which will connect you to activism and his family, Lagos, Abeokuta. So I think that for students, what do you identify with? What are you interested in? For me, it was literature and history and poetry per se, but there's so many ways. So I wouldn't think about it. History is never about learning everything, right? I think one thing that surprises students in my classes is how much there is to learn. Because, they've never been taught before. Many students, they've never had a Black professor or they've never taken an Africa class, and they're shocked about the volume of work. It's like very often I meet super smart students, but they've never had that Africa class. They've never had that Black studies class. And so, like you said, it is daunting, but I would say let your interests guide you. Are you interested in learning about the history of sexuality? Are you interested in learning about psychology, right? What is the history of sort of thinking about the mind? How do Africans, or let's say how do Yoruba, what do they think about the difference between the mind and the body and how people connect and things like that? Are you interested in language? I mean, I met a linguist recently. He learns, like ancient languages in like the Congo area. I would just say let your interests guide you. For me, like I said, I was interested in science fiction, and that's part of the way I started reading more African American texts and literature. So I would say identify your interests and see how you can match them, but also do something new, right? For me, it would be like taking ironically, like West African dance class. They're here. It's funny. It's called West African dance, but it's a very big place. So so it's very different from, let's say, anything I've experienced per se. Because sometimes it can be about Senegal and Mali, and I'm from a different part of the coast. So I would say, reach out to people. Here at UCR, I don't know if you've seen it, but every quarter there's a Black Studies sort of poster of all the classes that are available all around the campus. And I think it goes to African student programs and other places. So there's so many classes. And sometimes there are classes on Africa that may not have Africa in the title. So I teach a class in the winter on maps. And of course, you can imagine, I draw maps, I make maps. I'm interested in maps of the world. So there will be a lot of Africa content in that class. Right now, I'm teaching a class called Digital Storytelling. And I've been telling my students it's like perfect for this, not perfect. It's a really great class for this timing because not only are we all online now, we have to learn how to communicate online, and part of the material we use for the class is thinking about African cities. So there's so many ways you can learn about Africa. Just dip your toe in, or African American studies. Dip your toe in. Are you interested in anthropology? Or are you interested in something you've never heard of? Try something and see what you're interested. See what happens. That's what happened for me. You never know. You could go from engineer to something else, or you could just have. Or join a book club, right? To read something. There's so much to read. But I would say the problem is, how do you sift through all the information? How do you sift through how do we sift through the politics, like sort of the politics of all this information? How do we sift how do we sort of work through the ideology? People use knowledge for all kinds of reasons, right? So how do you kind of absorb and discern what you're learning? So it's a lot, but I think that there's just and right now, people can learn in all kinds of ways. People are learning on Instagram. God help us. You know what I mean? So
YouTube University and all that. Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's very inspiring. And like my gateway was through psychology. So it really pushed me to kind of like understand more about that concept, those aspects. And I think that's inspiring for students as well. And it can be very simple, like getting in, like learning about African or African American or African Caribbean history or whatever geographical location.
I forgot food. Try some food. Try some injera. Try some, West African food. You never know. You may have a path through the culinary arts. There's just so much,
Yeah, and that's why I'm glad that you broke it down into like so many levels, from literature to dance to food to whatever it is, because all Africa plays a part in all of that. Like, and so I think it's important for students to know, like, it's a little bit easier than you think. So as we get a little bit closer to the end of the interview, I just kind of want to bring it kind of back more so into your research and just kind of really put some light onto what it is that you do. You mentioned a few of the classes that you teach, but if we can we try and paint a better picture for prospective students or maybe even current students who are looking to, get introduced to African history? What is it like being in one of your classes, and how can students be engaged?
I wonder if I'm the right person to ask. Well, I would say, what do my students say? I think that if you are, ready, I mean, a lot of our students are smart, they're committed, if you're ready to learn and you're ready to come on these sort of adventures and sort of learning, I think learning should be exciting and fun. I came to history to have a really good time.
Sure.
And, I find it, I think maybe the histories I grew up with, those days of history being sort of dry and uninteresting, that's over, right? Like, we are history is something we're invested in. History is something that affects us. Look, this is what I'm telling my students. Look around the world. Everybody wants to know now, right? What is the history of Black people? What is the history of Africa? What is the relationship? And historians will tell you that part of the kinds of questions we ask about the past come from our contemporary moment. So now everybody wants to know about, pandemics, about space, about cities, about culture, about race. There is actually a general interest now in these things. I think one of my favorite classes that I teach, so I teach classes on African cities. I teach general surveys on, let's say 19th century or 20th century Africa. We read a variety of things. There's a lot of film and different sources. One of my favorite classes that really takes advantage of the resources here at UCR is my African history in film, fiction, and science fiction class. And I said I was interested in science fiction before, so I try to make sure I teach things that I'm interested in, students are also interested in. And in this class, we think about the history of Africa and, what evidence do we have of the past, and how have other people thought about Africa? How have people written about Africa? What kinds of films have they made? And even science fiction, how has science fiction affected the way we think about Africa and African people and race and spaces and cities? So, for instance, when you watch sci-fi movies set in Africa, or you read books about. So Africa features in a lot of 19th century science fiction. It can be quite racist and quite terrible in some ways. But what does that mean? And why did people write things this way? When we think about books, for instance, we sometimes imagine if we have one question, what is the history of, let's say, let me think about this. So whatever question we ask, we think about how novelists have answered the question, how historians have answered the question, and how, let's say, movie makers have answered the question. So it could be a series of things. So we always compare. And it's very interesting. The last time I taught the class, Black Panther, I think, it had either just come out or was about to come out. And so many people don't know that the female warriors many things in that film are based on real things.
Sure.
So, people want to talk about, and of course I'm going to blank on the name of the warriors now, the female warriors. Can you help me? I'm totally blanking.
Can't, I know.
But you, okay, we're gonna have to edit this part. So the female warriors are actually grounded in a real group of warriors, inspired by a group of warriors in Benin Republic. And so many people want to use them as feminist figures. So the week we do, 1 week we do a module on female warriors. We read the Roxane Gay's version of World of Wakanda, where she fictionalizes that story. We also read the actual sources, the actual historical sources from the 18th and 19th century, writing about these real women warriors. And then we watch a little bit about the film. So on one hand, students are excited that women are strong, they're warriors, they're fighting for themselves. But what if I told you that one of the towns I studied was destroyed by these women warriors, right?
Wow.
What if I told you that these warriors from Dahomey attacked Abeokuta in March 1851? This is part of what the research that I do. And they caused quite a little bit of damage. I mean, it was great for them, but not so great for the people in the city.
Yeah. Wow.
So, these are thorny questions for historians, Why do we always look for heroes? And what do we do when we find out that there's a sort of, I don't know the American expression, but there's a sort of, the story is more complicated than we think. So in this class, we explore a lot of different questions. So.
No, that's fascinating. One thing that I always say is peep the context, and it's because
you can, exactly,
right? You can identify an isolated incident or an isolated group of people, and from a certain lens, it's something that you can champion and be behind, and like, wow, that's amazing. But if you're not telling the full story, you miss out on really trying to grasp what was going on in that time in history. And I think, obviously, I'm sure that's what your work really expands upon. So thank you for showing it or explaining it. And yes, another
I
thing.
Googled it, the Dora Milaje.
Perfect.
I was like, I won't be able to live this down. But they're called something different in Dahomey, and they even call them Amazons to sort of kind of like, well, that's a kind of European name for them. But there's a lot of stuff going on there. But
wow.
Anyway.
But thank you for sharing that. I think that's a pretty enlightening for students who might be interested. So we're coming up on the end, and I just have one more question, and this is I've really enjoyed our conversation so far. But with the work that you're doing and what you're trying to teach to students, but in particular trying to center our Black students, our African students, what is one of your most optimistic visions of the future when it comes to the upcoming generations of Black scholars through UCR?
Big question. Wow. I mean, I probably don't meet enough Black students. I'd love to meet more. I realize now I have to title my classes differently so I can get more interest. Sometimes the Africa is not the first thing that you see. I'm so inspired by our students. Young people are so brave. They're so bold. They're so outspoken. I mean, even now, in the spring quarter, it was the Black students who that I saw, they spoke up. They talked about the effect of the pandemic. People are unafraid to use their voice. They're unafraid to learn. They're very engaged. I think that there's a political awakening that's happening, and a political awareness, and I think a self-awareness I see in the younger generation that's so inspiring. I mean, even just around voting, people's rights, safety, issues around anti-Blackness, articulating these things and speaking up for themselves is so, I mean, they're braver than we are. They're definitely braver than a lot of us that are older. And I'm inspired by how brilliant and brave the students here are. I, want to meet more. I want to get to know them. I definitely want to do more things on campus. And part of this is also, reaching out to you and other people in this sense. I think students here should also, I guess one thing I would say I'm optimistic about the future is that UCR has a lot of resources, not just for professors and staff members, but also for students, right? Yeah. And so I think there's a lot that students can gain from being here, have access to so many people who will support them. But also, they should think of also another thing that I'm really optimistic about is the wider networks, right?
Yes.
I know here there's NSBE. So the thing I know about from the old days is NSBE is still a thing, the National Society of Black Engineers. And there's a chapter here on campus, and I've seen some materials from them. And also the wider UC network. The school, the undergrad I went to didn't have, 10 campuses. So this is something that will be really important, I think, for students. And I'm sure it's already important for professors. I'm sure there's definitely staff connections. But, I think this is something that students should leverage. And this is an incredible system. Yeah. We're very privileged to live in California when it's not on fire, right? But
yes.
So I feel like the combination of really bright and engaged students with understanding how to use those resources and utilize them, there's a lot to look forward to, I think, at UCR, especially as we all become more engaged and more aware of ourselves and the wider world and how the world has changed and is changing. So that was kind of like an upside down answer in many ways.
It was perfect. It was perfect.
But I think I don't feel discouraged when I think of the younger generation. I don't. I feel like people are so brave. Even in the pandemic, people are out. They're out there. They're protesting. They're marching. They're walking. They're coming to class. They're doing their work. They're speaking up to their professors. I mean, I feel like I want to be hopeful, and there's a reason to be.
No, that's beautifully said. And I agree with you 1,000%. The younger generations definitely leave. They just have so much that you make me feel inspired, that make you feel inspired. And it influences, how we try to carry out the work that we're doing. And I think that's also important. So thank you so much for joining us on the Blue, Gold, and Black podcast. We're super happy to amplify your voice. Super excited for students to have the opportunity to engage with you and to take your courses and to broaden their perspective. So thank you. We're going to definitely have to have you back so we can keep pushing this conversation forward. But thank you so much for being with us.
And thank you, Dominique, for doing this. I think it's I've seen some of them already. It's really wonderful to, know who's here, especially in these days we can't really connect. It's really important, I think, for community building to see that, we can still connect and we have something to look forward to when we can get off our couches and stop working on the couch.
Right.
All right.
Well,
good.
Professor Ademide, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And everyone else, we'll catch you later on the Blue, Gold, and Black podcast. Thank you for joining us on Blue, Gold, and Black. This program is produced by the Community Engagement and Outreach Unit of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of California, Riverside. Learn more about attending UCR by visiting admissions.ucr.edu, and be sure to check out the description for other useful links and resources. Help support this podcast by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And be sure to check out our podcast videos on YouTube. Catch you guys later.